Okay, so today is lecture 2 in this 5-lecture series on the biochemistry of food. And I'm going to talk about one of our favorite food topics today, which is, let me go on this here, the carbohydrates. All right. People like carbohydrates, and as I mentioned last time, kind of globally, 80% of all of the calories humans consume really come from primarily carbohydrate foods, and that's mostly rice, corn, and wheat. And so what we're looking at here are, of course, the main things in our diet. So our main carbohydrates are things like rice and various kinds of pasta and bread, etc. Potatoes are, largely starch. So it's really a major way we get energy in our body. And we're going to really pursue that a little bit this time, but mostly in the next lecture, how you go from carbohydrate to energy. All right. And so it's, as I said, it's where most of our calories come from. Now, for many people in the United States, not OLLI people, I'm sure, but for many others, you may know some of them, they get a lot of their carbohydrates in this form, and that is sugar. So a lot of candy is just kind of pure sugar with a little food coloring added, a little gelatin to hold it all together. And in terms of dietary challenges for us, sugar is really one of the major things we have to think about. So many people in America get a lot of their caloric intake from just straight soluble sugar in the form of sodas. And these have become bigger and bigger with time. But it's not just soda. I mean, you hear lots of people pointing out that we drink too much of this. And it turns out that something like 75% of the soda consumed in the United States is the full sugar soda. It's not as though people are all drinking diet sodas. That's a rather small portion of the total. But there's a lot of carbohydrate, a lot of sugar in these other kinds of things that we drink a lot of also, even though they might look like they're really good, 100% fruit punch. But the truth is they're mostly just refined sugar. And we're going to talk about what that means today. So just to say a little bit about this issue, I think a lot of the people listening to this class can think back when they were kids. And if you got a bottle of Coca-Cola, especially back into the 50s, these were very little bottles. I mean, they didn't have the big, whopping size bottles that we have today. And then in the 1960s, they switched over to 12-ounce bottles, doubling the size. And then in the 1990s, they went to 20 ounces as the possibility that you could get. And now it's gotten just ridiculous. I mean, this is 42 ounces, but I was looking this up. 7-Eleven now sells one that's 64 ounces. Not only do you have to contend with the sugar, but you can get back problems just trying to carry it out of the store. All right. So this is a problem with our diet, that too much of one type of nutrient, and that is sugar. So let's look at the question of what is sugar anyway? So carbohydrates are made of simple sugars. And the name carbohydrate comes from the fact that chemically, you take one carbon and one water molecule, and you bond all of those atoms together, and you get a carbohydrate. So the most important sugar in the living world, and this is true for virtually all creatures from bacteria to humans, is the simple sugar glucose. It has 6 carbons in it. And if you look at each of these carbons is bound to a molecule of water, a carbon plus H2O, carbon H2O. And it all balances out here. This one at the end has got an extra hydrogen, but this one is missing, so it's still on balance. There's one water molecule for each of the 6 carbons. This is a simple variant on glucose. You notice the main difference is up here. It's that it's got this double bonded oxygen, but it's still one water for every carbon. And so this is a hydrocarbon. All right. Now, sugars come in hundreds of different molecular forms. So in addition to these common 6-carbon sugars, glucose and fructose, you find 3-carbon sugars, 5-carbon sugars, 7-carbon sugars, and depending on exactly how you arrange the atoms on the individual molecule, you get many different structures, and they play different roles in the biochemistry of our body. So in addition to these 6-carbon sugars, the other most common kinds that we have in our cells, and this is true of all creatures, is this 5-carbon sugar ribose, and this slight variant on it, deoxyribose. So where do you find these? Well, DNA is deoxyribose nucleic acid. So this 5-carbon sugar is a part of the DNA chain that makes up our genome. Ribose is what is in ribonucleic acid. The ribo in ribonucleic acid refers to the fact that it has a ribose sugar in it. And interestingly, the chemistry here of one simple atom kind of determines our destiny in a big way. In that, what's the difference between these two? And the difference is that this one has an oxygen there, and this one doesn't. So DNA contains deoxyribose. It's missing an oxygen without oxygen at this position. And what is the difference? Well, it turns out that oxygen, as I mentioned before, is a very reactive molecule. And so this oxygen here can combine with other atoms. And if you have polymers of the sugar as an RNA, it is more susceptible to bonding with other molecules and essentially coming apart. Whereas DNA has this deoxyribose, it's missing that oxygen, and it's a much more stable compound. And that's why we can recover DNA from creatures that are 50,000 years old, but the RNA is very unstable and you never recover RNA. So the simple chemistry thing is why our DNA is such a stable molecule. It's missing an oxygen at this critical component, critical part of the structure. All right, now, the sugar that we most frequently encounter is sucrose. So your common table sugar is this molecule right here. And sucrose is a disaccharide. That means that it is made up of 2 simple sugars. And these simple sugars turn out to be glucose and fructose. So here's the structure of sucrose. It has 6-carbon simple sugar here, linked by an oxygen to 6 carbons down here. And in your intestine, and in almost all living creatures, we have an enzyme that can bind the sucrose, bind a molecule of water, and add the atoms in water to break this bond. And OH in the water ends up on one sugar, and the other H in the water ends up on the other sugar, and it generates glucose and fructose, the two sugars that are common to kind of all living things. And it is the glucose that circulates in your blood and provides energy to all of the cells of your body. People who have diabetes have difficulty in regulating the level of glucose that's in the blood, and that's critical because it's the main source of energy for all of your cells. All right, so water is involved in forming and breaking many types of bonds, but this is one of the most important chemical reactions in our body, the ability to take this very common sugar, sucrose, and break it into these two simple molecules that we can then move around in our blood and move across the membranes of our cells and take into the cell and use for energy. All right. So there are different sources of sugar that we get in our food, but they are really all very similar in their chemistry. So typically, most table sugar either comes from sugar cane or sugar beets. And in both cases, that sugar is sucrose, this disaccharide. Sucrose, we eat it, it goes into our stomach and then into our lower intestine, and there is an enzyme called invertase, that splits it into fructose and glucose. So ultimately, when you eat sugarcane sugar, you end up with 50% fructose, 50% glucose. And beet sugar is identical. Now, the other sugar that we encounter so much in our diet, and is the major component of all of those sugary drinks, is high fructose corn syrup. Now, the reason for this is that, one, it's cheap, and two, it comes in a liquid. So in processing various kinds of processed foods, it's very easy to precisely manipulate. And so that's why it's become such a big part of American diets and diets around the world. But what it is chemically is really almost identical to table sugar. There are actually a few different kinds that are produced. They start out with corn starch, and they use enzymes to produce this mix of fructose and glucose that's much like what you get from table sugar. One of the reasons for this is it has slightly more fructose, and it turns out that fructose tastes sweeter to us. So you'll like the fact that it will be sweet, and that, of course, attracts people to eat more of it. All right. Now, you would think, all right, so is high fructose corn syrup particularly bad for you? No, it's really the same as eating a lot of table sugar. And what ends up in your bloodstream is the same level of fructose and glucose. Now, you might think, all right, what's a real kind of natural world way to get sugar, not to be eating all of this processed refined sucrose? Well, maybe honey that's made by bees out in the wild. But what is honey made out of? Honey, in fact, is almost identical to high fructose corn syrup. It's 55% fructose, 45% glucose. Honey has a few other things. It has probably a little bit of pollen in it, etc. And so often they recommend that you don't feed honey to infants, for example. And that's because honey can have small amounts of proteins that can be allergens and cause an immune reaction to a little kind of protein contaminants that can be in honey. Now, the one that's different from these others is starch. So I mentioned this is a major part of our diet: rice, potatoes, corn, wheat, all starch. Starch is pretty much a chain of pure glucose molecules. I'm going to show you that. And so what you get is 100% glucose from starch, and you don't get any fructose. And that could have important implications for our diet. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, a few slides down the road here. Okay, and as before, people have some questions. Any questions up to this point? You can unmute yourself and ask a question if anything come up that you want to talk about. Okay, so what is starch? Starch is made up of chains of glucose. So remember, starch is made by plants for their own purposes. Starch uses photosynthesis and carbon dioxide. They use the energy from the sun to put these carbon dioxide and water molecules together to make carbohydrates. And a good way to store it in a sort of dry form is granules of starch. And so when we eat seeds like rice or wheat, we're eating the sugar that the plant has stored for its progeny. The idea is the seed will be planted and the seed will use that starch as an energy source until it can get up and make green leaves and start using the sun directly. So each of these is a glucose molecule connected to the next glucose molecule by an oxygen. And we have enzymes, they're in our mouth, they're in our small intestine, to add water to every one of these bonds and break them apart into single glucose molecules. And starch is not exactly soluble in water, but all of these can be coated with water, and that allows the enzymes to get access to the starch. And so we can chew it up to produce glucose quite quickly. All right, which is why it's such a major component of our diet. Now, there have been, over recent years, actually for quite a while, the whole question of whether sugar is really bad for you or not. And the bottom line is, it is fine as long as you don't eat too much of it. Now, there's an interesting twist on this debate about whether sugar is good for you or not. That really has been somewhat generated by this man, Dr. Robert Lustig. Now, he's a pediatrician at University of California, San Francisco. And his concern has been the large number of obese children he's seeing. And he's taken the position that sugar is really, can be very bad and is a major reason why we have a major medical problem in the United States. And this problem is what is called metabolic syndrome, which is a combination of obesity and diabetes, and that can also lead to some cardiovascular issues. Now, Lustig, however, has taken a slightly different view of it, and he says that the key thing is that, I'll go back here, is that it's not sugar per se, but that it's the fructose. So I've told you that all of the table sugar we get, honey, high fructose corn syrup, is about 50% glucose, but it's 50% fructose. And there's kind of good support for part of what Lustig is saying, is that glucose and fructose are handled quite differently by our bodies. And to grossly generalize, we've really kind of set up our metabolism to handle glucose. We use hormones like insulin to carefully regulate the amount of glucose in our blood. Fructose, on the other hand, is handled differently in our body. It's mostly metabolized in our liver, and it largely goes into fat metabolism. And if you have an excess of sugar, the fructose will be very quickly converted to fat and stored there. Now, there's been a lot of investigation of Lustig's argument, and there's one good counter argument to it, that arguing that fructose is not bad for you. Everybody agrees, Lustig agrees, that say fruit is good for you. So if you eat an apple, you're eating a lot of stored carbohydrate in that apple. And what is it? Well, here's what's in an apple. So the kind of sugar that's in an apple is it's 20% glucose, the single ring, 6 carbon. It's 23% sucrose, the disaccharide. And this sucrose, once you eat it, it's converted to glucose and fructose. But the major sugar in an apple is fructose. And the whole apple contains about 100 calories. So, is this fructose bad for you? Well, where the kind of nutrition people are coming down to is it's really all a threshold issue. And that is that clearly fruits are good for you. I mean, there's lots of dietary evidence to show that. And the fructose in the fruit is fine for you. It's just a question of not eating too much of it. So it's possible if you have one of those 42-ounce sodas that you are eating an amount of fructose that would be equivalent to about eating 15 apples. And so if you're just eating a lot of sugar, it's not good for you. And it could be because of the excess fructose. But as long as you have any sort of normal, reasonable consumption of fruits, I mean, you could eat 5 apples a day easily and not be to a threshold level where the fructose is going to throw your carbohydrate metabolism out of balance. And that seems to be the consensus among scientists today. So is fructose bad for you? Yes, if you eat an awful lot of it, but the amount that we eat in fruits and other things are fine for us. Any questions about that issue? Okay.
Wait, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't mention orange juice, which I don't think you mentioned it, which I understand has about the same amount of sugar as a Coke, so that it's much better to eat oranges than to have orange juice, which has the image of being something really healthy, I think.
I think it's a good point. I think most nutritionists would say that once again, orange juice is fine in reasonable doses, but orange juice does taste very sweet, and people can end up consuming a lot of it. And it is sort of unfortunately an easy way to probably get too large amount of sugar in your diet. And a lot of pediatricians now say, you know, don't feed little kids a whole bunch of orange juice, and don't give them a lot of those fruity drinks, because a lot of them are just really loaded up with sugar. That's good point. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about using your kind of biochemical knowledge when you go shopping. One of the things that has prompted me to do this course is, you know, as a biochemist, whenever I go to the grocery store, I always find things like, what? This is ridiculous. You know, what are they trying to sell here? And I'm going to show you a few of my favorites. So, for example, the idea that high fructose corn syrup has been particularly demonized. And my point is, chemically, it's no different than table sugar, and it's the same problem issue applies. Just don't have too much of it. But so if you want to get some French rolls and you say, is this one with the no high fructose corn syrup going to be better? Well, take a look at the back of it, and the ingredients will be there. And what does it contain? It contains liquid sugar, and that is almost certainly sucrose, and that means it contains fructose and glucose. So it's really not any different if it had sucrose in it versus high fructose corn syrup. Chemically, it's the same thing. All right. Let me give you another example. Whenever I'm walking through the grocery store and I see all these labels telling you about the merits, the healthy food merits of their particular product, I start to get a little skeptical. And this one here, Heart Bar, this is kind of pushing the edge, I think, trying to say that we bake the thoughtful mix of tasty and heart-healthy ingredients together to create convenient snacks that are truly good for your heart. Well, then it's got all these good things in here: plant sterols, source of fiber, whole grain rolled oats. So what is this really? So the Heart Bar. So you look on the back, you go through the ingredients. So here it is. So serving size is 1 Heart Bar with 180 calories. Not too much fat, you know, it's about 25% of the calories comes from fat. That's okay. All right, and then it gives the breakdowns, no cholesterol in it, sodium's not bad, etc. But what are the major ingredients in this? Well, the first thing is rolled oats. You know, it's basically an oatmeal cookie is what it is. But the second most abundant thing is date paste. What is that? It's sucrose. Tapioca syrup. It's sucrose. Invert sugar. I told you that the enzyme that breaks sucrose into glucose and fructose is called invertase. And invert sugar it's sucrose. All right. Contains apple juice concentrate. Well, we now know that that's mostly fructose. All right. Plum puree, probably mostly fructose. Evaporated cane's juice, sucrose, rice syrup. Rice syrup is at least mostly glucose. But this is just a sugary chocolate chip cookie when it comes down to it. And so, you know, when I see this sort of thing, and it's talking about how it's truly good for your heart, you know, the thing that they're pushing here is that it has oatmeal. And oatmeal is made from oats, which is a plant. And all these cells have some sort of sterol like cholesterol, but plants don't have cholesterol per se. They have other things like one called brassicostirol, et cetera. And there is some evidence that if you have these plant sterols, that it somewhat competes with the uptake of animal sterols like cholesterol across your intestinal membranes and into your body. So yeah, oatmeal is kind of good for you, but that's really all this is. This is a very sugary oatmeal cookie. And I think, you know, calling this thing a heart bar is so it's some magical ingredient within it's got all that sugar in it. It's just not, to my mind as a chemist, an honest way to sell a product. All right, I give you one more. All right, this one stood out because it is healthy noodle. And if you look up on top here, it's got all the good things: fat-free, gluten-free, cholesterol-free, dairy-free. All right, and in fact, it really caught my attention down the bottom here. It's only 25 calories per serving. In terms of being free of everything, it's also seemed to be free of any source of energy. This means that you would have to eat 100 servings of this healthy noodle in order to get enough energy to survive for one day. So what in the world is in the healthy noodle? So let's look at the back of this one. Calories, only 25 calories per serving. No fat, total fat, none. Cholesterol, none. Carbohydrate, almost none. So you start to wonder, well, what is in this anyway? And when you get down to the bottom and you look at what the ingredients are, it's water, it's fiber powder, and it's cellulose. So mostly it has the same composition as paper. You could go ahead and eat the box and end up with the kind of the same nutritional output as eating this healthy noodle. So I think this is a good example of a really over the top to say this is a health food when it has almost no nutrition in it at all. Now, is it good for something? Well, its big plus is that what it does have is it has this fiber. So cellulose is a long chain molecule that's made that is a large constituent of the cell walls of plants, and that's fiber. This soybean fiber powder is going to be rather complex in having many different kinds of long chain sugars linked together in these complex fiber molecules. And so I'm going to take this to lead you into the whole fiber question, because we've been told that fiber is important for our diet, and it is, But what is fiber anyway, and why is it important? But there's one more thing I noticed on this that I looked into a little bit. So it has this alginate, that's a kind of gelatinous stuff that comes from algae, really, and yam konjac powder. Now, if you're an advocate of health food stores, you may know what this is. I didn't know that, but I looked it up, and here's what konjac powder is. So it's made from this konjac plant, from the roots of this konjac plant. And what's unusual about this plant is that it has very large amounts, 45% by weight, of a type of fiber called glucomannan. Now, this word tells you its chemical composition. It's made up primarily of two simple sugars. One is glucose, and the other is mannose. And they're strung together in a chain. This is just part of the molecule. It doesn't show you the whole thing. And this long chain forms a fibrous molecule in this plant. And it has the following property. In fact, all glucomannans do this. Glucomannans are common in plant cell walls. This particular one just has to have a very high proportion of this particular type. So what we have here is our cartoon to illustrate the fact that one of these things that the glucomannans do is they can bind many water molecules. So in purple here is this polymer. So here's a sugar, here's a sugar, here's a sugar, here's a sugar, and they're all linked together to make this long chain. The chemical structure is such that if you look at these little ends on the molecule, they are very good binding sites for water. And so if you take glucomannan powder and you put it in water, it will swell up and make something like gelatin. In fact, that's exactly how, Jell-O does the exact same thing. You start out with a powder and you add a lot of water and you get something that's only 2% the original Jell-O and 98% water, and yet it's sort of solid. So this is a part of why this molecule is used in the healthy noodles and some other foods, all right? But they're used for kind of two reasons. Why would you want a molecule that forms this sort of Jell-O-like material? Well, first of all, people use it for constipation. And that is that if you have this in your digestive system, especially in your lower intestine, then all the material there in your lower intestine is going to be much more hydrated. It's going to be much more soft and squishy as opposed to dehydrated, harder material. All right. The other thing is that if it swells up when all of the water molecules bind to it, then you're going to feel full. And so people use this as a possible dietary material, that it makes you feel full even though you can't digest it. There is a downside to this, though, and in looking up information on this, I found that the European Union has actually recently banned the use of these glucomannans for some sorts of candies, etc., that are given to children because of a possible choking problem. I mean, you could see what could happen is if you actually just took some of the powder that was kind of somewhat wet, but had not all absorbed all of the water that it was capable of absorbing, then it would go into your stomach, it would swell up, your stomach would feel very full, but this can be a bad thing if it swells up too much. So what is this this particular fiber, glucomannan. Okay, so water-soluble polysaccharide. That means instead of having 2 sugars, a disaccharide like glucose, it has many sugars in a long chain, polysaccharide. It's considered a dietary fiber. It's a hemicellulose. That means it's related to cellulose that you find in the cell walls of some plant species. It's used as a food additive, and they use it that way because it helps to emulsify, mix up all the ingredients, and it helps to thicken it because it goes from being watery to being sort of syrupy, gelatinous. So products containing glucomannan under a variety of brand names are marked as dietary supplements with claims that they can relieve constipation and help lower cholesterol levels. Since 2010, they're legally marketed in Europe as weight loss for people who are overweight and eating a diet with restricted calories. But as of 2020, there's no good evidence that glucomannan helped with weight loss. This is true with so many things that when you take them at first, you do lose weight, but if you follow up in these people 2 months later, their weight has gone back to where it was. So supplements containing glucomannan pose a risk for choking and bowel obstruction. It can just swell up and form a plug, if you will, if they're not taken with sufficient water. Other adverse effects include diarrhea, belching, bloating. In one study, people taking glucomannans had high triglyceride levels. This is, the fats in your blood go up. They're used to supplement animal feed and to help the animals gain weight more quickly. That weight gain is largely water. So it's an awful lot on a kind of obscure ingredient in the healthy noodle. But the bottom line is, I don't know, I just feel that when you see these real dietary claims made from this food, just be skeptical. Be skeptical about it. All right, any questions about healthy noodle or any of those food labels that I've tried to illustrate? Okay, we'll move on. So, what are good fibers? I mean, fiber is supposed to be important in your diet, and why? Well, they're almost all polysaccharides, strings of sugars, and then other types of atoms get added in too as little side chain decorative elements in this complex molecular structure. So cellulose, interestingly, is really just like starch. It is a simple chain of glucose. Starch is a chain of glucose. So what's the difference between cellulose and starch? Chemically, it's very simple. I mean, if you can see my hands over here, in one of them, you link the 2 glucoses together like this, and in the other one, you link them upside down. Instead of like this, you link them like this. The difference is that one of these, water coats the molecule easily, and that means the enzymes can get in there and break the link. In the other one, they tend to line up all of the chains side by side, excluding the water. The water can't get in, and this bond can't be broken. And so starch is easy to digest. You can get the water in there and break it. Cellulose is impossible for us to digest. We cannot break those bonds. And in fact, all of the animals that live on eating grass, etc., in which they have a large amount of cellulose, those animals, those cows, they do not have an enzyme that can break down cellulose either. But in their digestive system is a host of bacteria and fungi that do make the enzyme that can break down cellulose. And so they can use cellulose as a food source. All right. For us, though, in our diet, generally, cellulose is an indigestible fiber. but it plays an important good role in our digestive system, and I'll come to that in a little bit. So you can get cellulose from basically anything that's a plant cell because it's a major structural component of the plant cell. So cereals, fruit, vegetables, all plants in general. Chitin is a little variant on it. It's found in fungi and in insects. You know, there's always a push to put more insects on our diet, and you would still get good fiber, it'd just be a slightly different form of fiber. Hemocellulose is what we just talked about. Glucomannan is one of those. Our sugars, this is 6 carbon sugars, 5 carbon sugars. Lignin is a very complex, almost plastic-like part of the cell wall of plants, very difficult to digest. There's certain kinds of gums, etc. All right, so these are all water-insoluble dietary fibers, good for us in our diet. All right, so where do you get them? The best place to get them is things that have a lot of cell walls of plants in them. So green vegetables, excellent source. Beans, legumes, green beans, kidney beans, all of those kinds of beans are really good types of fiber. Fruit has some. Fruit's got a lot of very watery cells, so it's not as enriched as eating broccoli or green bean, but it's still a good source of fiber. And it makes the point of here about the McDonald's Big Mac. When I was saying, you know, the Big Mac per se is good food. The problem with is what it's missing. And so if you eat meat and just bread, which is just, you know, derived from almost entirely from starch, there's almost no fiber in a kind of all meat, all bread diet. So Big Mac, low fiber, that's one of the problems of eating only Big Macs as your source of nutrition. Okay, so why is this important? Well, there seem to be 2 reasons why fiber is important. And so let's take a look at our digestive system. One thing to remember is that as food comes into your mouth and down your throat and into your stomach and through your intestines, it's really in contact with the outside world. I mean, anything that can get into your mouth, you know, all of the fungi and bacteria and dust and everything that you breathe in through your mouth can, in principle, have access to your whole digestive system. Now, the first place your food goes is into your stomach. And your stomach is a very hostile environment for most living organisms. For one thing, it's very acidic. It's like pH 2. You know, I remember when we were kids, they used to try to frighten us from drinking too much Coca-Cola because they said, if you ever put an iron nail into a bottle of Coca-Cola and you wait, you know, a few weeks, the nail will completely dissolve because Coca-Cola is pretty acidic. But Coca-Cola is about pH 4 or something. Your stomach is 100 times more acidic than Coca-Cola is, so it has no trouble handling it. But then once the stomach serves primarily just a sort of rough grinder, getting all of that food ground up and exposed to the water and all the enzymes that are in your digestive system. And then it goes on to your small intestine, where all of the real processing takes place. And after it's kind of extracted most of the food from it, it ends up in your large intestine, where somewhat is the water is somewhat removed before it goes out as the feces. The role of fiber is kind of twofold. One is the fact that a lot of these fibers, although they don't dissolve, they do bind water molecules. And so they make a kind of wet, squishy environment, if you will, inside your intestines, which is good for all those enzymes to mix up with the food you ate so they can break down the large, long chains and the more complex molecules like proteins into smaller molecules like simple sugars and amino acids that can then be transported across the membranes that line your intestine and taken into the inner part of your body, ultimately ending up in your bloodstream and then be processed ultimately by your liver. All right. The second reason why the fiber is important is because although we can not digest it, we, just like cows in a way, have a host of bacteria and fungi in our intestine that use this fiber as a food source. And this is something that's really been researched more intensely in the last 10 years or so, and we're starting to learn a lot more about this. This is, of course, called our microbiome. And so we have anywhere from 500 to 1,000 different kinds of bacterial and microbial cells in our intestine, and they serve a number of important roles there. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Now, the reason we're making progress on this recently is that we now have these great ways of sequencing DNA quickly and cheaply. You know, if you go back, you know, before the year 2000 or something, and you wanted to know what microorganisms were in your intestines, it was a difficult scientific question to answer because you'd have to get a sample, then you'd try and spread it out on Petri dishes, and you would see what grew. And you had the problem, first of all, that a lot of them, turns out, you couldn't grow them once you pulled them out of the intestine. They had some special nutritional need that we couldn't identify in the lab. And then when you got a colony growing in a cell, how do you know if this one is different from this one? They all look alike. All right. What changed all of that was you just take the sample from your intestine, extract all of the DNA from it, sequence that DNA, and then from the analysis of the DNA, you could find out how many different kinds of microbes were in fact in your intestine. And as I said, we found that it's certain, it's not just random. There are many creatures that specialize living in our intestine, but we contain somewhere between 500 and 1,000 different kinds. So what do? Well, they help us digest the food that our bodies can't break down. A lot of that is fiber. Some of the fiber can be digested, a lot cannot. A lot of it can be sort of partially digested. So it helps the body's metabolism by extracting more energy from the nutrients in the food. All right, I'll show you a little bit more on that. There are a couple kinds of vitamins that we can't make in our cells, but we got the bacteria in our gut to make these vitamins. Certain B-type vitamins, for example, vitamin K, can be made by the bacteria if we've got the right ones in our gut. There are toxic compounds that we can't degrade, but the bacteria can. And just this general coating of the mucus layer that lines the inside of our intestine, a component of that is some beneficial microorganisms. All right. So from this study of the kind of microorganisms we have in our intestine, have come some really fascinating results. And it's still in the early days of this type of research. But one of the interesting things that came up early on was a correlation between obesity versus kind of normal weight and the different kinds of bacteria that were found in the intestine of very obese people versus people with normal weight. So early on, there were some really fascinating experiments with mice where it was found that if you took a normal mouse and you gave it broad spectrum antibiotic, which would kill all the microorganisms, and then you took the microorganisms from a very obese mouse and put it in the normal mouse would become obese. The obesity seemed to be linked to the ability of the organism to convert more of its food into body mass. And so experiments like this are really being intensively looked at. And you wonder, well, why in the world would that happen? Well, what could these organisms be doing? And one real possibility is that if you contain a number of organisms that are able to digest dietary fibers that the normal bacteria cannot digest, then food that is indigestible to some people is digestible to the obese person. And the normal person doesn't gain calories from eating this food because it just goes right out into the feces. Or to the obese person, this is a source of calories. They can use it to make fat, make more cells. And so I'm oversimplifying it. It's we don't know that that is exactly the situation, but it's a very feasible explanation for this old puzzle of why some people just seem to gain weight and others didn't, even though the caloric intake may be very much the same. Maybe due to the ability to extract food and energy from these otherwise indigestible fibers through the actions of the bacteria they have in their intestine. Really interesting. Any questions about that? Let me just give you the opportunity here. Okay, we'll move on. So the demonstration that these bacteria can be very good for us has led to a lot of marketing of probiotics. And probiotic, that word, is used in different ways by different people. But basically, a probiotic is considered to be a good bacterium, one that would be good for us. And the supplements, the probiotic pills, the probiotic enriched foods that you see typically have 1, 2, 3 different kinds of bacteria that for which there is some evidence that they may be good for the proper functioning of your intestinal tract. Now, it should be said that one thing that a lot of the science people are a little skeptical about in terms of the value of these probiotics is that I just told you that typically we have about 1,000 different kinds of bacteria. And these probiotic supplements often contain only one kind or 2 kind. And we don't know to what extent they're able to survive the passage through the stomach, which will kill most microorganisms, etc. And so kind of before this talk, looking up to see where do we stand today, here I think is a good, reasonable summary of it. So this is the National Center at the NIH that's giving advice on probiotics. So they say, although some probiotics have shown promise in research studies, strong scientific evidence to support specific uses of probiotics for most health conditions is lacking. And if you look at the National Institutes of Health, guide they give to doctors, they use some probiotics and microbe manipulation for some pediatric diseases. There's some children early on that just have not established the right intestinal flora, and they found that they can successfully treat, for example, some severe life-threatening forms of diarrhea. But the experiments with adults have been less clear. Among other things, it's just very difficult to kind of permanently change the kind of bacteria you have in your stomach, because you're just breathing in bacteria every minute. And even if you take some pill with 1-2 kinds of bacteria in there, it may be there for a couple of days, but then your own flora is going to reestablish itself. So the microbial composition of the gut microbiota, bacteria, varies across the digestive tract. In the stomach and small intestine, there are relatively few species of bacteria. The colon, the large intestine, in contrast, contains a densely populated microbial ecosystem. Huge. This is a 10 trillion cells per gram of intestinal content, 300 to 1,000 different species. This is an interesting number. Bacteria make up to 60% of the dry mass of feces. You go to the toilet, most of what's coming out is part of your intestinal flora. And then in addition to the bacteria, there are some fungi, most of them are yeast, protists, small organisms, these extremophile bacteria, and tons and tons and tons of viruses, most of which are viruses of bacteria, bacterial viruses. All right. So an area of intense study, really interesting, finding something that we didn't know 20 years ago here, but as with everything else, be a little skeptical about magic miracle cures for probiotics. Okay, so one of the things that these bacteria are doing is, if we eat plant cell walls, as I said, a lot of these fibers are indigestible to us, but the bacteria in there can break them down, and often one type of bacterium is not enough. Some of the initial breakdown steps, maybe chopping these long fibers into shorter fragments, will be done with one species of bacterium. And then the shorter fragments will be cut down to even smaller molecules by another species of bacterium. And from very complex molecules, we generate very simple molecules, acetate, butyrate, etc. These are 2-carbon, 3-carbon molecules. They can cross the membranes that form the kind of outer barrier of our intestine and get into the bloodstream. And these are molecules that can be used as energy sources for the body. And so that goes back to this possible mechanism for a correlation with certain microbes and obesity, is that people with the right microbes can get energy out of food that is indigestible to other people with just a different set of microbes in their intestine. Okay, so if you want to follow this up, this book came out a few years back. I read this book and found it to be very interesting in terms of, it's written for a general audience. It's not one that requires that you have a scientific background. He gets into it pretty deeply, but really fascinating. Talks about, of course, our skin is just covered with a whole other set of bacteria and yeast, and different parts of our body contain different microbiomes. So it's a really interesting new discovery based on our ability to sequence DNA and find out what's in us and on us. Okay. So kind of coming to the end today, although I got about another 10 minutes that I want to use to kind of prepare you for the next lecture. So the carbohydrates, most of them end up as glucose. And the main way we get energy, allows us to walk across the room, allows us to lift things, operates our nervous system and our eyes, is by this reaction of using the atoms and electrons in glucose and passing them on to oxygen, which has a high affinity for electrons. And in this transfer, the high energy in these electrons is used to drive biological processes. And the result of this is glucose plus oxygen plus water will ultimately produce carbon dioxide in water. I want to go back here. And some of the atoms are used to add to the mass of our body to make more cells, etc. And some of that is used to make energy. So we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out CO2 and water vapor. And we want to look at the question of what happens to this oxygen that we breathe in? Where does the CO2 come from? Where does the water vapor come from? What is the energy that we get out of this glucose? Now, in order to understand this, we need to know what enzymes are and how they work. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes here on enzymes as preparation for our next lecture. So basically, enzymes are little chemical catalysts, little chemical machines that speed up the rates of chemical reactions. So let's say this is sucrose, a disaccharide. In our intestine, there is an enzyme, invertase, that has a pocket on its surface that is just a precise match to the surface of a sucrose molecule. And this molecule is banging around here and it bounces into this enzyme and fits snugly into that pocket. Now, what's shown in, not shown in this simple cartoon is there's going to be another little pocket for a water molecule. And the water molecule will sit right here. And on the surface of this enzyme, as they're all jiggling around, the atoms will start to interact with their neighbors. And if the water is added at quite right precise place, the sucrose will split into glucose and fructose. And this goes much faster than if this were just bouncing around with water molecules. It goes much faster if it's sitting on the surface of an enzyme that holds all the reactants together in just the right position and at just the right distances. That's what enzymes do. So enzymes, almost all enzymes are proteins. There are a few RNA molecules that can function as enzymes, but they're very rare. They are formed by long chains of amino acids, proteins are. Typically, they will have up to 500 to 1,000 amino acids in the chain. This is what an amino acid looks like. We've looked at this last time. This is the amino group. An amine contains a nitrogen. This is the acid group. It's our carboxyl acid. An acid is something that can give off a proton, and this proton can pop on and off this oxygen. That's why it's an acid. So you string many of these together, and you get a protein. So here would just be a cartoon of, this is a real protein, one that degrades RNA and RNase. And this particular one is a very small one. You see here is amino acid number 1. And it has a grand total of 24. There are 20 different molecular forms of amino acids that appear in proteins. There's this 3-letter code that you learn early on as a biochemist: threonine, alanine, lysine, etc. Okay. And they fold up to produce a molecule that can look like this. So this sort of representation is useful because we're seeing every atom in this molecule. So these white ones are hydrogens bound to an oxygen. That's a carbon, the gray ones. A few yellows here. These are a couple of sulfur atoms in this. And they will form this complex structure, and it will be very stable at body temperature. And what holds the things together is if there's a positive charge on this molecule and a negative charge on this one, they will be electrically attracted to each other. And by all of these interactions, they will come to some stable final structure. Here's another way to portray this. So here you see all the atoms that are in this protein, this folded up long chain of amino acids. And there will be somewhere on this surface a pocket that is just the right size and shape for some other particular molecule, like maybe only sucrose, maybe only an amino acid, maybe DNA. Maybe there's an enzymes in there that clip DNA. So they will have a pocket precisely fit to the reactants that they're going to bind to. So this substrate is the thing that's going to be the reacting molecule will come into the pocket. And in some cases, when it does, the enzyme will fold onto it to line up all the atoms more tightly. Then the chemistry will occur in here. These atoms will be arranged and the pocket will open. And just a cartoon of how that might happen is, so let's say we have these three components of this molecule bind to the enzyme here. And nearby, we have three components that bind close to this part of the enzyme. And you're going to have a reaction in which this blue one gets added to the end of this chain. So you'll end up in an intermediary situation where the blue one will bind to the red one and still be bound to the enzyme, but it's no longer bound to these two. And these two will go floating off, all right? And then this one will release from the enzyme. And now these four are all linked together, and that will release for the enzyme, and your chemical reaction has occurred. So it's all facilitated by the enzyme putting the right reactants close together in the right space so that these molecular rearrangements can occur. Okay. So that's how enzymes work. And that will be very important when we talk about how you get energy from your food next time. So just to summarize this last bit, almost all enzymes are proteins. They're formed by long chains of amino acids, typically have 500 to 1,000 amino acids. They make chemical reactions go faster than they would if they were just bouncing around in the water. Enzymes have an active site, so that's the place on the enzyme where a specific molecules, the specific is important because they only do a very precise, limited kind of molecular rearrangement. We have at least 10,000 types of enzymes and everything from fungi to human cells. In our cells, we probably have something close to a little in excess of 20,000 different kinds of enzymes. And the function of our genes and DNA is to encode the sequence of amino acids that makes each of those enzymes. And lastly, that enzymes are also good to eat. Enzymes are protein. And like one of the most abundant proteins in the world is the enzyme in green plants that binds carbon dioxide from the oxygen to make sugars. But to us, when we eat the green plant, it's just another protein, and we chew up its amino acids and make it into our own kinds of proteins. All right, so with that, we've gone through the different carbohydrates and the sugars. We've had our introduction to enzymes. We've touched on fibers and the microbiome. So I'm going to open this up to questions. If you have a question, just unmute yourself and go for it. So any questions out there? Got to have some questions. Harriet, and then Cindy. Okay.
I've seen in the popular literature a lot of reference lately to resistant starch. It hasn't appeared on boxes of food yet to promote them. And it was listed along with other fibers in your chart. What is resistant starch? Okay,
good question. You know, this, I was teaching biochem once, and a student said, I've heard that if you cook your spaghetti and then you just put it in the refrigerator, and then you eat it after it's been refrigerated, then you won't get as much calories from it. And I said, well, this is crazy. But it turns out it's correct. It actually happens. So it's related to the business I told you about, the difference between starch and cellulose, is that one's soluble in water and the other is not. Well, it is true that if you take potatoes or pasta or whatever and you cook them, when you cook them, you kind of disturb those molecules are bouncing around. And so their uncooked structure is opened up. And then when they cool back down again, they can form a sort of more crystalline arrangement where the starch chains are so close to each other that it's difficult for the water to get in there. And because of that, your digestive enzymes can't convert the starch into glucose. And so you eat it and it just passes through your digestive system, largely undigested. Now, those bacteria in there will get some of it, but apparently this is really true. And you may have noticed on that chart I had for dietary fiber, one of the things at the bottom it said resistant starch. So yeah, it's a real thing. And now they make it resistant in the processed food industry, and then we'll add it to foods like healthy noodle, etc. All right, good question. Cindy, you had Cindy Zacco.
Yeah, I have a brief question. We have a friend who maintains that long ago when chocolate was made in our time, and I think the company was the Snickers company, who said, what, that's Mars or something.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, they said that the quality of the sugar was a pure sugar, and then they went on to do simple sugars or corn processed sugar. And he felt that that was a whole world of difference in terms of the flavor, as well as he feels it may have added in general to the obesity problem because of the different kind of sugar that's being used.
Well, it's possible. I mean, one of the reasons to use the different sugars is they do have different levels of sweetness. And glucose is not, I think glucose is the least sweet, sucrose is next, and then fructose is the sweetest. And so, by doing different mixtures of that, certainly the food processing companies know these precisely, and they want you to eat more of it. Mm-hmm. So, there's probably some truth in that, and that it probably did taste a little different. And the bottom line is the food companies have been very successful in making things really taste good. Mm-hmm. And this combination of sweet and salty and a little fatty, something like Cheetos or potato chips, nearly irresistible. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think your friend probably was onto, there's some truth in that, yeah. And
I want to thank you for the hint about cooking your potatoes, putting it in the refrigerator and taking that. That's good.
I don't know if you have to keep them cold, if you heat them back up again, at some points it's going to solubilize the starch.
Oh, I wondered whether it would not.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I don't think it's permanent. Yeah.
Too bad.
Okay. But I guess cold potato salad is less calories than hot potato salad.
Keep the mayonnaise off.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Okay, other questions? And
Barry?
Yes.
Hi, first of all, oh, wait a minute. Let me do it that way. Hi, first of all, thank you. Is there something about the make-believe sugars or the fake sugars, the stevias and those things that affect us or that are different because they're not natural sugars?
Okay, so basically, why do things taste sweet, etc.? And so you have proteins, complex proteins in your mouth and other places that have binding sites for things like glucose and sucrose. Mm. And their function is not to do any chemical reaction, but just to recognize the molecules there. So if you eat sucrose, there's a protein that binds to a receptor And that receptor sends a signal to your brain saying, lots of sucrose here, lots of sucrose, you know, eat, good stuff, eat more, right?
Okay.
But the sucrose goes on and off, you know, and when it comes off of the receptor, then the receptor turns off. So what the artificial sweeteners and the natural sweeteners like stevia, et cetera, did I pronounce that right? Anyway, what they will do is often they will go and bind to the receptor and they will stay there permanently. It's permanently locked on. So you only need a tiny amount of them at very low levels to tell the cell, oh, there's lots of sugar out here, tasty, good stuff, high energy, you know, keep eating. Now there's some evidence that, you know, how do you know you're full? Your brain is getting these messages from your mouth saying lots of energy material out here, keep eating. But your stomach, meanwhile, and your intestine, more importantly, at some point says, we've got all we can handle down here, you know, stop eating. And so there are receptors down there that are kind of report to the brain how much sugar is in your intestine. And there's some evidence that although sucrose binds the one in your mouth and binds the one that says you're full in your stomach, some of the artificial ones only bind to the mouth one, but not the stomach. So the on signal, eat more, is functioning, but the off signal does not. And so it's kind of perverse. It's a way in which artificial sweeteners could actually end up kind of making you keep eating more. Now, this is,
Okay.
I don't want to say that that is, you know, rigorously shown, but there's some hypothesis that happens. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Let's see. Pagatha. Oh, and you're muted. Good.
Yeah, okay. Is unrefined sugar better? You know, I always buy my sugar from Trader Joe's and it looks natural and it's not so white. And with the assumption that it's somehow better for me, is it?
Probably very little difference. You know, it's still, you know, it comes down to a question of whether it's 98% sugar or 99.5% sugar, you know, and I don't know, the unrefined stuff, you know, what is the other, it is slightly colored, you know, often the unrefined stuff. So it may be just other parts of the sugar cane or parts of the other sugar beet. I would be skeptical that it's any better nutritionally. All right, other questions? All right. Okay. Got any more there?
There's a chat.
Well,
there's a
Jenna.
chat- There's a chat question.
Oh, okay. I'll open that. All right. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. So one of them here is, can you discuss the energy involved in producing different sugars? My impression is that corn syrup is environmentally most unsustainable. I don't know why that would be true. I mean, the corn syrup is subject to an extra step than eating sugarcane syrup, in that they have to do a processing of taking the starch and then industrially adding enzymes to get the glucose and the fructose. So there is a little bit more resource use in that step, but I think in the larger scale of things, it's probably a tiny difference. Which bacteria are most prevalent in the gut? You know, if you really want an answer to that, the font of all wisdom, Wikipedia, is a pretty good source. I was looking that up. There are a few classes of bacteria that are are really specialized in the human gut, and it will tell you their names. Okay, and I don't remember them. My dentist insists when it's that when it's necessary to use antibiotics, one should take kombucha routinely. I know nothing about it, but I would be skeptical. Okay, all right, and then sweeteners like stevia react in the body the same way as glucose. So I answered that, and it's mostly that they bind so tightly to the receptors that report sweetness, etc. That's where the difference comes into these artificial sweeteners.
Well, stevia is not artificial.
Okay.
So
Yeah, right. It's not. It's yeah, and there's some, just super sweet natural compounds, and that's what that does. Okay.
Mary, is last week's class available via recording?
It has been. I hadn't put it up yet, but I will do that. An older version before Zooming is available, and the content is identical. So if you go and just look at that in the OLLI list, it's there. It's number one.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay, Ron.
Where do we find the recordings, like of this class, for instance?
Yeah, so if you go to the OLLI website, on the bottom, scroll down in the first page, it'll say recorded OLLI presentations. And OLLI now has a YouTube website. When we first started that, among other things, they said, well, you have to have 100 subscribers to keep it going. And will anybody ever look at it? We now have about twice as many subscribers as we do members. We're approaching 1,000 subscribers to our website. And we've got quite a few of these recordings during the COVID era have been reviewed thousands of times. So I don't know, we have a global reach here. And it's satisfying in some ways. All right, other questions?
Yeah, I do.
Yes.
The question is, some of us have conditions where we end up taking pretty powerful antibiotics for quite a long period of time. And our doctors generally recommend probiotics, but not the kind you get in drugstores, but the kind that you can get in places like New Leaf.
Mm.
And that does sometimes say it has 1,000 variations, or at least several hundred variations. And that's why I'm wondering what you were saying seems to run. Otherwise, other than you can always eat yogurt, sauerkraut, and things like that and get some of it back. But how were they recommending, if they believe that probiotics don't work, that you get the biome back once you've pretty much destroyed it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's really an interesting question, because when you take antibiotic, it really does wipe out most of your intestinal flora. And yet, I think, we've all had to do that at a time or two, and it's usually not, particularly upsetting to your digestive system or such, but in a week or so, it's gone back. So, as far as the recommendation, I think the status of it right now is that how our bacteria flora gets in there and what mix we have is sufficiently complicated that we don't really understand it very well. And so I think when your doctor is recommending a probiotic, it's in the situation where it doesn't seem like it can hurt. It might help. So let's do it. But of course, there are big clinical studies being done on how effective they are, and the results are just very mixed. Some works for some, it doesn't work for others. The degree to which it persists is highly variable. You know, and it's not surprising. You know, the other thing that's come out of this is, does the intestinal flora of somebody who lives in the US versus France versus Thailand, do we all have the same? It turns out, no, it's wildly, wildly different. So I don't know, what about Nevada versus California? I mean, wildly different. So is there going to be one probiotic that's good for everybody? Probably not. It's just such a complex situation there that's going on. And you've got this whole little ecological environment going on in your lower intestine. So there's just not a simple fix for it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe we'll wrap it up there, folks. So thanks for the turnout today. And next time we're going to be dealing with the energy question. How do we get energy from our food? And what is the energy after all? All right. So I hope to see you all next Tuesday then.
Thank
Mary,
you.
but please do post this one before the next class.
Okay. Okay. I can do
Thank
it next day or two. Okay, good.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks.
To- He's a great teacher.
He is. Knows a lot, skeptical about a lot,
Uh-huh,
which is interesting. I am
Yeah,
too. as well.
yeah. That's good. I found